We are going to explore history of Vikings. Welcome to the global studio. Vikings were Scandinavian naval warriors who, between the 9th and the 11th centuries, invaded and settled large swaths of Europe. Their disruptive presence had a significant impact on European history. These raids by these pagan warriors from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were likely motivated by a number of motives, including the relative helplessness of victims overseas and domestic overpopulation, landowning chieftains and clan chiefs, their servants, freemen, and any active young clan members looking for adventure and treasure abroad comprised the Vikings. These Scandinavians were self-sufficient farmers at home, but they were robbers and pillagers at sea. The Scandinavian nations appear to have had an almost limitless supply of labor throughout the Viking era, and there were rarely shortages of capable leaders who could unite bands of warriors into victorious bands and armies. Along the European coast, these bands would conduct hit-and-run raids on cities and villages while navigating the oceans on their longships. In the early Scandinavian languages, they were referred to as Vikingar, which means pirate, for their burning, pillaging, and murdering. In certain instances, the precise ethnic makeup of the Viking forces is uncertain, although the Swedes can be fairly blamed for the Vikings' spread into Russia and the Baltic regions. In other places, it is evident that the Norwegians successfully colonized Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and the Orkney Islands without using force. Along the European coast, these bands would conduct hit-and-run raids on cities and villages while navigating the oceans on their longships. In the early Scandinavian languages, they were referred to as Vikingar, which means pirate, for their burning, pillaging, and murdering. In certain instances, the precise ethnic makeup of the Viking forces is uncertain, although the Swedes can be fairly blamed for the Vikings' spread into Russia and the Baltic regions. In other places, it is evident that the Norwegians successfully colonized Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and the Orkney Islands without using force. England, a force led by Ragnar Lothbrok's sons, Holborn, Imwerever the Bonus, and possibly Hubberub, overran the ancient kingdoms of East Anglia and Northumbria in 865, reducing Mercia to a fraction of its former size. In England, desultory raiding took place in the late 8th century, most notably the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne, Holy Island, in 793. However, it failed to defeat Alfred the Great's Wessex, with whom a ceasefire was established in 878, and which served as the foundation for a treaty in 886, or shortly thereafter. This acknowledged that Denmark controlled a large portion of England, even though they were under constant pressure from new Viking forces between 892 and 899. Alfred eventually defeated them, and Wessex's spirit was so unbroken that his son Edward the Elder was able to start the reconquest of Danish England. The minor Danish states on former East Anglian and Mercian territory had fallen before him before his death in 924. Although the relatively isolated Northumbria resisted longer, mostly under Irish Viking lords, Edred eventually destroyed the Scandinavian dominance there in 954. In 980, Viking attacks on England resumed, and the nation eventually joined the Canutian Empire. However, the native house was quietly restored in 1042, and Canute II's ineffectual passes during William I's reign put a stop to the Viking danger. Social structure, dialect, place names, and personal names were all profoundly impacted by the Scandinavian conquests in England. See Danelaw. In pursuit of the country that Bjarni had spotted, men under the leadership of Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, made their way to eastern Canada. Leif's brothers supposedly went on later expeditions, and Thorfinn Karlsefni, an Icelandic trader, led a different expedition that stayed in Vinland for around 3 years. Leif is introduced as Vinland's unintentional discoverer in Eirik's Saga Rawa. All further exploration is credited to Thorfinn and his wife, Gudrid. The Vikings did travel at least as far south as regions where grapes grew wild, according to archaeological finds at Lanceau Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland Island, Newfoundland and Labrador. This led to the conclusion that the Vikings first encountered North America in eastern New Brunswick, which is the closest region to Lanceau Meadows where grapes would have been found. Records of Scandinavian invasions of Ireland date back to 795, when the unnamed island of Retru was devastated. Fighting continued from that point on, and Scandinavian kingdoms emerged at Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford, despite the fact that the locals frequently more than held their own. Several of the Dublin kings governed both Dublin and Northumberland in the early 10th century, and for a while they felt powerful enough to venture abroad. When the Irish Scandinavians, aided by the Earl of Orkney and some native Irish, were soundly defeated at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, the possibility that Ireland would be united under Scandinavian leadership vanished. However, the Scandinavians were still in charge, albeit Christianized in Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, Wexford, and Cork until the English invaded Ireland in the 12th century.
France and the Carolingian Empire, the well-defended Carolingian realm, was never settled by Vikings on the same scale as the British Isles, and outside of Normandy, Scandinavian influence on continental languages and institutions is negligible. But until the end of the Viking era, there were occasional raids. In the 10th century, colonies on the Seine River gave rise to the Duchy of Normandy, the only long-lasting Viking accomplishment in Charlemagne's former realm, see Norman. The Vikings occasionally plundered the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean shores, which are farther south than France, but they rarely achieved anything significant. Eastern Europe compared to the Viking expansion on the Atlantic coasts, the Eastern Viking expansion was most likely less violent. No Viking empire was established with the sword in the Baltic, despite the fact that there was undoubtedly a great deal of occasional raiding there, and that the phrase "to go on the East Viking" meant to engage in such action. The Scandinavians' journey into the center of Russia was their most significant eastern migration. It is challenging to determine the extent of this invasion since, despite their dominance in Novgorod, Kiev, and other cities, the Scandinavians were quickly assimilated by the Slavonic populace, to whom they gave the name Rus, or Russians. Two of their economic treaties with the Greeks are preserved in the primary chronicle under the numbers 912 and 945. The names of the Rus signatories are unquestionably Scandinavian, indicating that the Rus were among the principal traders. But like their Western relatives, the Rus occasionally tried plundering expeditions. At the latest, they stopped existing as a distinct people around 1050. There seems to have been a new Viking eastward march in the first half of the 11th century. The names of the men who accompanied Ingvar on his travels are listed on several Swedish runic stones. Only mythical descriptions of the exact course and purpose of these eastward-bound expeditions remain. The Scandinavians also served as mercenaries in Constantinople, Istanbul, where they were part of the Byzantine Emperor's Varangian Guard. The Viking leader was a thing of the past after the 11th century. Denmark became a conquering power, able to incorporate the more rebellious sections of its populace into its own royal army, whereas Norway and Sweden had no more force for exterior expedition. Before ascending to the throne in 15, Norway's Olaf II Haraldsson was essentially the final Viking leader in the long-standing independent tradition.